welcome to PwC's Boardroom Forum Live. Today, we're in the third episode of our series on business model reinvention. In our previous episodes, we discussed the concept of BMR and why it's important. We also covered aspects around how it can be used to drive value creation and growth. Today, we'll be shifting gears a bit and delving into the topic of the operating model as it relates to business model reinvention and specific tax considerations. Joining me today, I have Marthle Plessis as well as Osman Mollagee. Welcome.
Thanks very much.
Marthle. Thanks, Osman. Marthle, perhaps I'll start with you. Given our discussions on business model reinvention and its significance, how should organizations approach the alignment of their operating model with their strategic goals?
It's always a strategy-led conversation. And I think if you watch the news and you look at the political landscape today, what's happening in the US and China and other parts of the world today, it is going to fundamentally impact how businesses adds value, the services, the products that they design and deliver, and the way in which they do it. So business leaders today, more often than not, go back to look at strategy, see where they need to pivot, and then the question is, how do we deliver, or how do we bring that strategy to life? And that really is what operating model or business model reinvention is about. It is about having a very good understanding where those shifting profit pools sit today, because the landscape is changing fundamentally. Is the products and services that you still offer relevant? Is the ecosystem in which you operate, how has that changed? And how do you need to adjust to that? And therefore, if you have answers to those fundamental questions, it is to say, how do I realign my business capabilities, the people that work for me, and how do I deliver that in the most effective manner? So business model reinvention is always, it starts with a strategy-led conversation.
So very interesting, and I'd imagine there's some tax considerations that one needs to bear in mind. So I think, Osman, perhaps that's a good segue to check in with yourself. What are the key tax considerations that organizations need to keep in mind from both a compliance and optimization point of view in this transformative journey? Particularly also considering, I think, some organizations are multinational. So what does that involve from a tax consideration?
And yeah, no, I think there are a couple of things, and again, you use, like, I think, trigger phrases like transformation. Marthle used the term pivot, and I think there are a couple of tax issues, but all of them are really triggered by the fact that there's change. And in the case of BMR and just re-looking at your business model, your operating model. There are a couple of taxes, but I have to say probably the top of the list is probably, you would have heard this before, is transfer pricing. And the reason, and if I can maybe just oversimplify, the reason transfer pricing is a big deal is because transfer pricing is primarily about, if you look at your overall revenue and profit pool for your multinational organization, how do you split that up amongst various jurisdictions? And when you look at BMR, you end up thinking, okay, we're doing something different here. So there are two things that shift here, or probably many things that shift, but the two categories I like to put them in from the tax practitioners and revenue authorities are primarily interested in is that, number one, there's a potential change in your market. Who are you actually generating revenue from? And that's one. And then the other one is internally, how do you actually deliver? Marthle spoke about value chain and you know, just realigning how you're going to deliver what needs to be delivered. And that means different parts of your business potentially in different countries will be doing different things or doing similar things differently, more efficiently. There's a lot of detailed discussion about how that might be restructured. But what that ends up meaning is entitlement to profits in each jurisdiction is likely to move. And that's what revenue authorities are interested in. And that's really the main point about transfer pricing. There are a couple of other issues, and they're all related to the fact that there's change. You know, are you giving up something? Is there a disposal? Is there CGT? Is one part of the business essentially stopping what it used to do or taking on something new? And you'll have additional flows, you know, between between entities in the same group. And typically you'll have tax people talking about things like withholding taxes and having efficient flows within the group. But as you would have heard, that there'll be a few, but those are probably the key ones at the top of the list.
But very important that those are right.
Yes, no,
Yeah.
no, and that is probably a point that I'm going to repeat again is, while the discussion might not be tax-led, tax might end up being a deal breaker if the model ends up being less viable or not viable because of your tax risks.
Okay, no, thanks for that, Osman. Coming back to you, Marthle, in one of our previous sessions, it was highlighted that BMR involves rethinking and reshaping core elements of an organization's operating model. What is the role that operating models play in the reinvention process?
It is a critical role. I always say that strategy will remain strategy on paper unless you can design your ways of work in such a way that people do work to deliver on your strategic intent. And the way that that is organized is through an operating model mechanism. Now, Osman made a very good point just now. We did a project together quite recently where the business had a change in strategy. As a result, they moved from various parts within the world. We knew that they would have to identify new business capabilities in order to deliver on that requirement. That will result in work being delivered in different parts in the world, and it will have a fundamental tax implication. So maybe to close the loop on what Osman said, as much as it's strategy-led, an operating model indicating where capabilities will be delivered from, tax needs to be part and parcel of that conversation, because it may result in shifting the amount of work, the volumes of work, and where work is delivered. So the connection between your operating model and your tax component is critical and key. Also, what is the role that operating model play? Business model reinvention is about doing something fundamentally different, something new. So it is about identifying what are those new value propositions or revenue generating entities that we are going to deliver on, and how is that going to impact my way of work. Sometimes organizations focus on a small piece. They identify the key and critical capabilities, but then it's about how do I gear my organization to deliver on the minimum viable product in such a sustainable way that I can later on then scale. And how do you start to do that? It is about your go-to-market strategy. How does it change you taking this fundamentally new value proposition to the market? It is about how do I gear the engine of my business, the operations, in such a way that I can deliver on this new value proposition in the most efficient and cost-optimized way? How do I design my business to use the right technology and other enablers so that I can scale if my value proposition finds the hearts and minds of people? And then lastly, what is my plan then to scale in such a way that I take the trends that's happening in the world out there and I still pivot in a way that will be relevant to my business and what we want to achieve?
I like the term pivot. It speaks about being adaptable. I think very relevant. But I think coming back to the point you're raising around tax, I think that's a thread that we're sort of making emphasis on, and rightly so. As soon as business model reinvention comes into discussion, several CEOs immediately start thinking around the tax implications. So what's the role that tax plays in these instances? And I think, Osman, you'd be well suited to respond to that.
Yeah, maybe I'll just go on a slight tangent. I mean, I think pivot used to be only a physics concept until COVID, and then everyone in business was pivoting, and I think we're still continuing to do that. But to your point there, I think there's, for me, in the role of tax in the context of BMR is not significantly different from what generally the role of tax in a multinational organization in business should be. And I typically have like three headings that I like to address. The one is just the point about financial viability. And the question of what is your after-tax result, when we talk about financial modeling and all of those kind of things, is trying to factor in all of the risk areas. And remember, these risk areas, and as I said earlier on, these risk areas are now changing slightly because you're doing something new. So factoring all of those to ensure that you remain viable is probably the most important part of the role of tax in the tax considerations here. The second part is about about making sure that we don't lose out on what I refer to as the sweeteners in the system. In other words, how can your result end up being even better because certain areas are just generally encouraged by economies? I mean, like, for example, and I know one of the things, and we didn't mention it today, but one of the big drivers of BMR is changes in technology, AI, and all of those kind of things. So when we start talking about things like research and development and just doing new things, and there's a big focus on intellectual property, many markets will offer you incentives to do that in their jurisdiction. So the one thing you don't want to miss out from a tax perspective is to take advantage of those opportunities that authorities are offering us to make sure that we set up in those jurisdictions for those kind of incentives. So the second element is for me not hugely critical in the overall viability of our BMR journey, but it is for me a big deal in making sure that we're not losing out on the opportunities that are being given to us. And then the last thing is really just what I don't want to make a comment about back office and administration, but just compliance and actual finance and tax function in administering all of this. I mean, Marthle used the example, and it's quite important to Marthle, is scalability. So once so when we talk about scalability, we're not necessarily doing something. So, I mean, BMR by itself is doing something different. But now that we know what we want to do, scalability is about almost repeating the process in a broader market in multiple jurisdictions. So making sure that the tax risk remains low or managed, it becomes a more critical aspect of the tax function. So the tax function not only needs to deal with generally keeping the organization safe and managing risk and keeping us compliant, but the scalability element in the context of BMR becomes even more critical.
So if we maybe drill down a little bit further, when it comes to some of the executives that might be involved in this, what should they be considering? What are some of the other key considerations in terms of that?
So, and I think maybe some of the points we mentioned before, but when we start talking about your operating model, for me again, there's multiple things here, and I want to repeat the point that we don't get driven in the BMR journey by tax, but let's make sure that we keep in mind that every single value driver has a tax implication. So, for example, when we talk about delivering on whatever our new value proposition is, we are the key people. Where do they need to be? Where do they have to be? Where can we not move them from, or where, etc. So, what are the tax implications of housing a particular, let's call it, center of excellence, or a particular value proposition in one jurisdiction? Where's your market? So, I think we can mention things like, tax technical things like transfer pricing, CGT, withholding taxes, but I do want to repeat the point, and it's generally relevant, it's just more relevant in the context of BMR, that look at what each aspect of what is relevant in what you're delivering and how you deliver it. Another thing I stole from Marthle, what you are delivering and how you're delivering it, how you structure your value chain. Each element of that has a tax implication. It'll have a domestic tax implication in the country that you're doing it, and it'll also have a cross-border tax implication if it becomes more efficient for you to do different things in different jurisdictions.
Okay, great. Marthle, I'd like to give you an opportunity to respond to the fact that it seems very daunting. It can be quite daunting. I mean, I think a lot of what you've shared, a lot of what Osman has spoken about, for those who are in leadership, what would you say in response to that if one is going on a journey of such in terms of BMR?
We run a leadership course at PwC called Leaders Solving for Tomorrow. And it's a fascinating course. We bring leaders across the globe together across multiple industries. And the leaders just talk about how does these mega trends like the political landscape, climate change, influence the ecosystem in which they operate, the strategy they deliver on, but also their ways of work. And today, we don't have a lot of time to think about it, design it, and implement it, because the changes are happening too fast and too quickly. So a few interesting things that the leaders agreed to or that they mentioned was, number one, leaders need to know that they will have to make sense of what's happening out there. No longer can you only focus on your business and your surroundings. You need to make sense of what's happening in the broader world out there. The second one is you have to be bold enough to set radical ambition. No longer, they say the light bulb wasn't invented by optimizing candles. No longer can you just optimize and improve or transform. You truly need to do something completely radically different. So set radical ambition. Then it's about being able to fuel the engine. So how do I find the right people, the right partners, the right business capabilities in order to deliver and pivot to what the market demand is? It is also about fueling the energy of your people. Strategy is delivered through human beings. You need them to be passionate, excited about the strategy that you put in place and the vision that they want to achieve. And then lastly, it's about getting involved personally to actively drive outcome until it shows in your bottom line. And if we keep those few things in mind, we find that leaders are on top of what's happening in the world and how they need to make the changes when it is necessary.
Thanks, Marthle. I think that's a great place to land today's session with a measure of optimism, actually. That's what I've taken away from that. Thanks to both you and Osman for sharing some of your great insights today. I think it is much appreciated. Lots to take away from our session today. For those of you who are joining us online, please do join us for our final episode in this BMR series. In our final episode, we'll actually be having an outside perspective. So we'll actually get a perspective from private sector. So we're quite excited about that and look forward to you joining us. Thank you.